The cloudy morning was barely lifting the city from its nighttime apathy. Jason stood on the corner, feeling every movement attract attention. In this neighborhood, every glance was an evaluating judgment, every shadow hiding a threat. The narrow streets were wrapped in a web of poverty and indifference, and the air was heavy with smog and machine noise. Outside the window, where rare rays of sunlight only pierced the clouds, his city lived its own life, growing more alien and cruel by the day. He knew, once you're here, all your steps are marked. 17 is not an age for dreams, it's an age for survival. Jason knew his parents couldn't help him. They themselves were drowning in the same muddy river they called reality. His mother worked 2 jobs to stay out of the threat of bankruptcy. His father disappeared like most men in the neighborhood. His life was decided in advance. Too dark a skin color, too much poverty, too much power wanting to destroy him. Today, like other days, Jason would try to walk past people he didn't know. But he didn't. He noticed the police cars flashing around the corner. He knew they weren't here to help, and he knew that being seen was always a threat. And here he was, with groceries for his mother, who might never come home with them. Crossing the street, he felt his heart beat faster. Don't look back, he thought, but his instincts were faster. A few seconds later, his world turned upside down. The police patrol stopped right at the sidewalk, as if they were waiting for him. Before Jason could even catch his breath, he felt a hand grab his shoulder. Instantly, as if on cue, everything froze. A flash of bright lights in the dark corner where he'd been standing, and there they were. Shouts, orders. His eyes had no time to register anything but his own hands gripping his back and a police voice shrieking, "Stop, boy!" His body shuddered in pain. Somehow, it was always like this. When you become a black teenager, you don't become human. Jason, still trying to figure out what was happening, found himself on the ground. The cop, not seeing anything human in his face, drove his knees into his back. It was so easy for them to crush him, to turn him to dust. He felt his face pressed against the cold asphalt, and an irritating warmth flowed from head to toe. Blood. He could hear them talking, but not a single word mattered. They were so sure they were right. One of the policemen laughed, laughing at something completely incomprehensible, not even giving Jason a chance to defend himself. His laugh was rough and harsh, like a knife stabbing into his soul. Everything in his laughter said that Jason was an object, not a person. Once in those chains, Jason knew one thing. His fate was sealed. But one thing he didn't know was that today was the day when everything would change. The day when the truth would come out and the world would see how scary and cruel the system could be. The day they would all be shocked. Jason closed the door behind him, breathing in the heavy morning air. The neighborhood was beginning to wake up. A garbage truck humming somewhere, the muffled voices of people buying drugs from street dealers on a corner somewhere. Such things were common here. But Jason didn't think much of it. Today, his mother had asked him to buy some bread and milk, a small thing, but even that could be the last request in this neighborhood. He shoved his hands in his pockets, head down, the way he always did when he went outside. Too direct a stare could be taken as a challenge. Walking too fast could be seen as suspicious. Too slow, too. Here, one had to exist in a perfect balance between stealth and caution. But no matter what you do, if you're black, you're always under suspicion. When he turned the corner, he felt the stares. They stung his back, clinging to his skin like dirt you can't wash off. Uniforms. A car with 2 officers stood across the street, engine idling, but their attention was on him. Jason forced himself not to change the pace of his stride. "Just walk. Just don't look in their direction," he repeated mentally, but it didn't matter. They've already made up their minds. "Hey, you!" The voice was harsh, filled with authority. Too familiar. Too familiar. Jason froze. He knew what to do. Don't run. Just don't. That would mean admitting guilt. But he knew something else. If you were black, the guilt was automatically on you. He turned his head, trying to look calm. "What's the matter, officer? Put your fucking hands up." Before he could even blink, 2 uniformed men got out of the car and walked briskly toward him. They weren't going to explain. They weren't even going to ask. "Where'd you get that, huh?" One of them jabbed a finger roughly at his plastic bag. Jason blinked. "In the store." At the store? Ha! Those black bastards, they always find something to lie about. Anger flared up in him. He wanted to object, but he knew he had no say in the matter. The next moment, strong hands grabbed him by the collar and threw him to the ground. "Didn't you fucking hear what you were told? Get down, you animal!" Jason didn't even have time to brace himself, his face slamming into the cold, gasoline-smelling, muddy asphalt. His hands were twisted behind his back, fingers digging into his wrists like the claws of a predator. "You've probably practiced that position by now, haven't you?" grinned one of the cops. The other leaned closer, his knee pressing right into Jason's spine, squeezing his breath. "That's it. That's where you belong." Somewhere in the distance, the footsteps of passers-by were heard. People saw. People knew. But no one stopped. "What did I do?" Jason exhaled through the pain. "You breathin' nigger." Those words hit harder than concrete. Jason gritted his teeth, trying not to let the tears come to his eyes. This was what they'd been waiting for. They wanted to see him weak. They wanted to break him. And then there was a burst of laughter. A coarse, heavy, crushing laugh. The policeman who had him on the ground was literally laughing in his face. "God, I love days like this," he said, loosening his grip a little. "When creatures like you get what they deserve." The other cop clapped him on the shoulder. "Don't cry so loud, Charlie. The cameras are outside." "What fucking cameras? Who's gonna do anything? Look at these people. They don't even look up. They don't care." And it was true. In this city, the police were the god, and black people were the victims. Jason knew no one would come to his rescue. No one. What he didn't know was that one camera was recording after all. And one day, this record will be the most important piece of evidence in his life. Let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you are listening to our stories from, and whether you have encountered something similar in your life. We need to know your opinions and stories. If you like what you hear, subscribe so you don't miss the continuation. And now we continue. Time seemed to stand still. The cold asphalt sank into Jason's skin, soaked with gasoline, dust, and the unseen blood of those who'd lain here before him. The weight of his knee on his back made it impossible to breathe, every muscle in his body shaking with impotent anger and terror. But the policeman who held him didn't say a word. He was just doing. Rough fingers dug into his arms as if testing how hard they could squeeze before they broke. The handcuffs weren't just tight. They were digging into his skin, leaving red marks. But even through the pain, Jason could feel the main thing. This man was enjoying every moment. The policeman was silent. He didn't shout accusations, didn't utter the usual phrases about resisting or detaining. He simply acted as if Jason were not a person, but an object to be picked up, crushed, and thrown away. Jason felt someone's hand grab his hair and yank him sharply upward. His head jerked and his neck crunched. Then he saw his face. An officer with short-cropped blonde hair, a hard jaw, and cold, colorless eyes. There was no anger on his face, no emotion, only contempt. Silently, without any unnecessary movement, he leaned slightly toward him, licked his lips. It wasn't just a gesture, it was a taunt. "Do you know what I like best about you?" he whispered at last. Jason gritted his teeth. His skin burned under that stare. Nothing. The policeman smiled slowly, lips stretched in a cruel grin. "Because you're a nobody." Laughter, a muffled, rotten laugh, like rusty metal scraping against glass. The sound was like poison, seeping under my skin, soaking into every cell in my body. There were people standing around. Some slowed their steps. Some just pretended not to notice that a few meters away from them lay a young boy with his face pressed into the concrete. They didn't care. Jason felt like it wasn't just his body that was dying. Something inside him was breaking. Indifference, brutality, impunity. "Remember this moment, nigga," a hissing, drawling voice, "because it will happen again." A jerk. His head was tossed down again. The asphalt met it with a crunch. Lips split open, blood on his tongue. And he kept laughing. That laugh will stay with Jason forever. Jason stood on shaky legs, swaying like a doll that someone had forgotten to steady. My ears were buzzing. There's a metallic taste of blood in his mouth. There's an emptiness in my chest. His lip was split open, the handcuffs digging into his wrist so deep that it looked like the skin was starting to tear. But the pain wasn't the point. It was the look in his eyes. The policeman, the same one who had just stomped on his face, now stood opposite, lazily blowing invisible dust off his uniform. His eyes glowed with infinite contempt. Jason knew that look. It was the look of a man who is sure he is a god, who can do anything and get away with it. There were people gathered around, passers-by. They didn't try to help. They didn't yell. They didn't do anything. They were just watching. Someone with pity, some with indifference, someone with secret satisfaction. But no one stopped it. "Look at them, boy." The policeman grinned, glancing around the silent crowd. "Who do you think wants you here?" Jason swallowed, keeping his gaze on him. "No one," the cop answered for him. "You're just another scumbag with nowhere to go." He slowly moved closer, his face a few centimeters away. "If I kill you now, will anyone even breathe?" Jason's eyes flashed, but he didn't say a word. He knew the answer. "Maybe your mom?" The cop grinned. "Though, knowing you niggers, she'd probably just get another one." Laughter. There's that laugh again. And the people around me? They were still just watching. Like a show. Like a circus. As if what was happening wasn't a crime. It's entertainment. "Come on, you son of a bitch. Say something." The cop stepped even closer. "Give me a reason to smear you right here." And Jason understood. He didn't need his resistance. He needed his fear. This officer lived for moments when black teenagers broke down in front of him. As their faces turned into a lump of pain and their spirit vanished. When they realized it was pointless to fight. But it won't break. He stood, clenching his fists, feeling his chest rise and fall with frenzied breathing. He wanted to scream. I wanted to rip through that rotten air with a howl that would go all over the neighborhood. But he didn't give them that pleasure. He was just watching. The policeman tilted his head to the side as if studying something. Then, with a mocking smile, he spat in Jason's face. Hot saliva ran down his cheek, and no one didn't say a word. There were people standing around. They saw, they knew, but they still just turned away. As always, only one camera kept filming. Only one truth lived in this moment, and soon it will tear this city apart. The cell at the station was tiny, dark, and smelled of sweat, blood, and fear. Jason sat on the metal bench, feeling the handcuffs squeezing his wrists. They hadn't even bothered to take them off. He was not allowed to speak, didn't get the call, no water, didn't even give a damn look that had a shred of humanity in it. From the moment he had been pushed into the car, it was as if the world around him had gone deaf. The cops were talking about him, but not to him. What? Another bastard who decided the laws weren't for him? Yeah, neighborhood stealing again, so we got him. We'll see what's on his tail, but I'd say this guy's in for a big one. Jason didn't steal anything. He carried bread and milk in his hands. But who cared? The system was silent. The system already knew he was guilty. Well, kid, you've been in jail before, haven't you? The voice of one of the cops, a fat white man in his 40s, sounded like he was talking to a puppy that had pissed on the carpet again. No, Jason answered quietly, not looking up. Really? The cop frowned theatrically. And you look like this. The other officer laughed, putting his foot on his leg. They all look like this. The eyes read guilty. Jason was silent. He knew that if he said a word, it would be used against him. That's the way it's always been. Any objection is resisting arrest. Any defense is an assault on an officer. Any attempt to ask for a lawyer is an admission of guilt. The system has already made its choice. Will you tell us how it was? One of them asked, sitting down across from me. I didn't do anything wrong. Yeah, sure, you're all saying that. The policeman suddenly reached out and took him by the chin, roughly lifting his face upward. Look up, damn it. I'm talking to you. Jason clenched his jaws. That's better. The cop leaned in closer. Do you know how easy it is for me to make sure you don't get out of here? He slowly ran his finger over his badge. You're just another piece of trash that no one will look for. Your mom will cry for a couple of days, but then she'll get over it like everyone else. He fell silent, savoring the moment. You do realize this is all just a game, right? Jason looked at him. A game you've already lost. The system was silent. She was silent when police officers lied in reports. She was silent when judges signed warrants without evidence. She was silent as black teenagers disappeared into those concrete walls and no one even asked where. But this time it will be different. Because someone saw it. Because the camera recorded it. And because this story isn't over yet. Time flowed differently in a prison cell. Here, minutes turned into hours, hours into days, and days into infinity. Jason sat on the cold concrete bench, hunched over, his hands shaking with anger and powerlessness. His wrists were still sore from the handcuffs that had torn away the skin, leaving dark streaks. The caked blood on his lips cracked with every movement. But all of that was nothing compared to what was going on in his head. He knew the world was unfair, but he didn't think he'd come face to face with it like this. Next to him sat other prisoners. Prisoners just like him. Just as guilty, simply because they were born black. The guy across the hall, thin, with hungry eyes, suddenly grinned, shaking his head. What, kid? First time? Jason didn't answer. Get used to it. It's like that around here, especially if you have dark skin. I didn't do anything, Jason finally said, clenching his fists. Minus E? You think it makes a difference? The boy leaned closer, his voice becoming almost a whisper. Don't you get it yet? They don't care if you're guilty or not. You're black, that's enough. Jason leaned back, closing his eyes. He knew it. He'd known it since he was a kid. I heard his mother say, "Don't argue with the police. Lower your gaze. Keep your hands where I can see them. And for God's sake, don't make any sudden movements." But even that didn't save him. The prison walls absorbed fear like a sponge. The cell was dark, stuffy, with the lingering odor of urine and sweat. Behind the bars, the guards white as those cops were standing with indifferent faces, not looking at them as people. "Hey, nigger," came the voice of one of the guards. "Get ready. They're taking you to the judge tomorrow." Nigger. The word burned through Jason like a flame. They didn't even hide it. "What the fuck do you want?" growled one of the prisoners. The guard only grinned. "I'm just breaking the news, even though we both know how it's gonna end." He leaned closer, smirking. "You think they're gonna give you a chance? You lousy black man?" Jason stared at him blankly, but said nothing. They expected him to explode. They expected him to show anger, but he wasn't about to give them that pleasure. When the guard left, the prisoners glanced around. "It's your first time, but it won't be your last if you stay here, brother," someone muttered. "I'm not going to stay here. It's not up to you." Jason knew the trial was a farce, knew they had already decided his fate. But this time it will be different. The camera caught everything, and when it comes out, the whole rotten world will shudder. Let's pause for one more brief moment. Write in the comments where you are listening to our stories from, and whether something like this has happened to you or your loved ones. It's important for us to know how you feel about these situations. If you're curious about what happens next, subscribe so you don't miss the sequel. And now we continue. The courtroom smelled of paper, sweat, and lies. Jason stood handcuffed in front of the judge, feeling the coldness of the metal cut into his skin. He wasn't a person. He was a case, a number in the system. He wasn't looked at as a person. He's already been convicted. You could feel it in the air. Everyone here knew how this was going to end. The prosecutor, a well-groomed man in an expensive suit, was leafing through papers boredly. He didn't even hide his contempt. "Let's get this over with quickly, Your Honor," he said with a smile, as if he were discussing a routine transaction. "It's obvious." Jason gritted his teeth. "Obviously? What's that? That I'm black? That I was on the street at the wrong time? That I bought bread and milk?" The prosecutor spoke quickly, clearly, as if reading from a script that had already been pre-written. "Guilty." The judge, an elderly white man with heavy eyelids and a tired face, looked lazily at Jason's attorney. The one sat back, with nervously tightened lips, clearly realizing he was playing a lost game. Everyone knew. No one in this court wanted the truth. They wanted to close the case. They wanted another statistical villain in prison. The defendant. The judge's voice was flat, indifferent, as if he was talking not to a person, but to an object. "What can you say in your defense?" Jason looked up. All eyes were on him, but he knew, no matter what he said, they didn't care. They didn't want to hear his truth. But, at this point, the courtroom door opened, and the world began to crumble. Things are going to change. The truth will come out. The courtroom was quiet. Too quiet. Jason stared straight ahead, knowing that everything had been decided. The system ran smoothly, like a lubricated machine, grinding through people like him day after day. But then, the door slammed. "Your Honor, we have new evidence." Jason's lawyer's voice came loudly, sharply, piercing the musty air of the courtroom. All heads turned toward him. The prosecutor frowned, his fingers tense, and the judge sighed heavily, as if he sensed this day was going to drag on. "What other evidence?" the judge threw irritably. The lawyer walked over to the judge's desk and put down the flash drive. "This is surveillance footage from the time of the arrest. They tried to hide it, but we got it." The hall froze. The prosecutor tensed. The policemen sitting in the hall looked at each other. The judge raised an eyebrow. "We demand an immediate viewing." A few seconds stretched like an eternity. The judge hesitated, but then nodded reluctantly. "Start the video." And then the real nightmare began. Street footage appeared on the screen. That's the moment. "Stop, boy." The cops attack Jason for no reason. He's being rolled on the ground. His knee presses him into the concrete. And then, laughter. That same disgusting, rotten laugh. The videotape captured everything. The insults, the contempt, the spitting in the face. "If I kill you now, will anyone even breathe?" The policeman's voice comes through clearly. There's dead silence in the courtroom. The prosecutor turned pale. The judge stared into the screen, his face tense. The police officers sitting in the audience slowly realized that their cover had collapsed. And Jason. He was just waiting for that truth to tear this rotten process to shreds. The videotape is over. But in the courtroom, the silence was just beginning. Jason looked at the judge, at the prosecutor, at the jury, and saw their faces. They were stunned. But not because they saw the truth. They knew the truth from the beginning. It's just that this truth has now become too obvious to ignore, too loud to be drowned out, too real. Breaking justice. The judge coughed as he went through the papers, but his hands trembled slightly. The prosecutor, who had looked confident a second ago, was now pale. The policemen in the audience, silent. They stared at the screen where their co-worker was chortling as he pressed the teenager's face into the concrete. Where he abused him like a dog. Where he said, "You're just another piece of garbage." In that courtroom, everyone heard every word. And now they had no chance to look away. A rage that can't be stopped. The woman on the jury, a dark-skinned mother in her 40s, suddenly covered her mouth with her hand. She cried. Not loudly, not hysterically, but with such suppressed, hopeless despair that the air in the hall grew heavier. Because she knew it could have been her son in Jason's place, knew it wasn't the first time, and knew that if it wasn't for that video, no one would have believed him. Someone in the audience whispered. Someone stood up abruptly. People moved in. Anger was beginning to fill the place like poison. The system's last chance. The judge took a deep breath. "Prosecutor, is there something you want to say?" His voice sounded different, broken. The prosecutor swallowed, realizing the situation was getting out of hand. "We, may need to investigate further." "Further investigation?" Someone in the audience shrieked. The judge clenched his jaws. He looked at Jason. And for the first time, the entire system was confronted with something it could not destroy. The incontrovertible truth. But will it be enough? Jason didn't move, didn't say a word. He was just waiting to see if he would hear the word today that was so rare for the likes of him in this city. Not guilty. Not guilty. The word Jason had been waiting for finally came out. But why didn't it bring relief? When the judge delivered his verdict, the courtroom was like a boiling cauldron. Some people cried tears of joy, others were seething with hatred, anger that won't go away. The policemen sitting in the hall did not move. Their faces were cold, frozen in masks of contempt. They didn't look at Jason as someone who had just escaped unjust punishment. They looked at him as if he was a problem that couldn't be hidden, as a mistake. The prosecutor, turning pale, quickly gathered up the papers and left without even looking the jury in the eye. The system didn't like being caught in a lie. But that wasn't the scary part. The worst part started after the trial. The city that was torn apart. That night was hell. As soon as the men left the courtroom, the streets of the city erupted in flames. They've pulled it off again. It was a show trial. It's not unique. How many guys like that are in prison right now? The crowd roared, people shouted names, the names of those whom the system had destroyed silently, without cameras or courts. The world has seen the truth. But did he see justice? Police officers don't forget. That same evening, writings began to appear on the walls of houses. Nigger got lucky. The next one won't go away. Jason realized they hadn't forgiven him for surviving, that he was still human. His mother started getting calls. "We know where you live. I hope you don't need a repeat." A truth that doesn't save Jason was free. But that didn't mean he was safe. The system lost, but it didn't break. She was just looking for a new way to shut him up. And now he knew the truth may come out. But that doesn't mean it will change anything right away. Racism doesn't disappear after one exposure. It lives in every look, in every law, in every form a judge signs. And now Jason was on the front lines of this war. He didn't want to be a symbol, but now he had no choice. The system won't forget him, and he won't forget her. The end, or is it just the beginning? Write in the comments what you think about this story. Have you experienced racism in your life or the lives of your loved ones? It is very important for us to know your opinion, because every one of you matters. We appreciate everyone who listens to our stories and shares their thoughts. If you like the issue, support us by liking and subscribing so you don't miss new stories. Write the phrase, "The truth must be heard," in the comments, so we know who listened to the end. Have a good day.